Champagne smells different when you're trying not to scream. Dessa noticed that at 9:14 p.m., standing in the empty hallway outside Suite 28C at the Ashmore Hotel, listening to a sound she would spend the rest of her life trying to unhear. She had only come up to find Noelle. The speeches were starting in 20 minutes. Her mother was already stationed at the front of the ballroom with a champagne flute and a specific kind of nervous energy that meant she had adjusted her corsage 4 times in the last hour. Dessa just needed Noelle. She needed his hand on her lower back, the steady pressure of it, the way he always said, "We've got this right," before any event that required them to smile at strangers for 3 hours. She had not texted first. That was the only reason she heard it. The unmistakable, rhythmic, deeply specific sound coming through the gap in the suite door. Dessa stopped walking. Her heels were new. She had bought them specifically for tonight, a pair of champagne-colored block heels that her sister said were practical, and her best friend Bree had called very you, which is a compliment. They made no sound on the carpet as she took 3 steps backward and pressed herself against the wall. She didn't push the door open. She didn't need to. She could hear the voice, Bree's voice, breathy and low, saying, not here," in a tone that meant the exact opposite, and beneath it, Noelle's familiar exhale, the one that meant he'd already gotten what he wanted. Dessa stood in the hallway for 11 seconds. She counted them. Then she smoothed the front of her dress, a floor-length emerald silk she had found at a sample sale for $60, and altered herself because she was, above all things, a woman who understood the value of $1. She walked back to the elevator. She pressed the button for the lobby and watched the numbers drop. In the mirrored panel of the elevator doors, she could see her own reflection. Hair pinned in a chignon her mother had spent 40 minutes on, diamond studs that had been her grandmother's, lipstick the precise color of dried roses. She looked exactly like a woman about to get engaged in front of 200 people. She looked like a woman who had not just heard her fiancé and her best friend through a hotel room door. She had the choice, then. She knew she had it. The elevator opened onto the lobby. She could walk through the brass revolving doors and out into the cold Chicago November and keep walking until the city swallowed her whole. She could go back upstairs, take Bree by the hair, and throw the Ashmore's complimentary flower arrangement at Noelle's head. She could sit in a chair in the lobby and simply stop functioning, which was what every nerve in her body was currently suggesting. Instead, she walked back into the ballroom and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. The next 17 minutes were the longest of her life. She spoke to Noelle's mother, who was already 3 drinks in and kept touching Dessa's earrings without being invited to. She spoke to the man from Noelle's office who had mispronounced her name for 6 consecutive years. She watched the door to the stairwell, which Noel and Bree finally came through at 9:31. Bree's lipstick, a specific shade of blurred that Dessa had known the name of since they were 17 years old. Bree met Dessa's eyes across the room. The color left her face in a single clean sheet, like a curtain dropping. Good, Dessa thought. She took a sip of her champagne and smiled at Noelle's mother. Noelle reached her side 2 minutes later, straightening his tie. He smelled of Bree's perfume. Bree, who had stood in Dessa's apartment last Tuesday and helped address these very envelopes, who had eaten half of Dessa's leftover lo mein, who had told her she deserved everything she was about to have. There you are. Noel slid his arm around her waist, easy and warm. I was looking everywhere. Dessa looked at the centerpiece, white peonies in a low crystal bowl, a name card that read Dessa and Noel celebrate with US. Were you, she said. The speeches began at 9:45. Noelle's business partner went first, a man named Tolman, who told the same anecdote about Noelle closing a deal on a ski slope in Aspen that Dessa had now heard 4 times. Then came her cousin from Baltimore, who read something off her phone. Then Noelle's mother, who cried on cue into a linen napkin. Bree was supposed to go last. The maid of honor speech, the one she had texted Dessa 3 different drafts of over the past month. Bree stood up. Her dress was ice blue, Her eyes were swollen slightly around the edges. Not enough that anyone else would notice, but Dessa had catalogued the precise topography of that face since she was 9 years old. "Dessa is the most loyal person I've ever known," Bree began. The irony landed in Dessa's chest like a stone dropped into still water. She reached for her champagne. And that was when the doors of the ballroom opened. Not the service doors, the main ones, the heavy mahogany panels facing the elevator bank. They opened the way a storm arrives, without announcement, without apology, as though the room had been expecting them and simply hadn't been told. 4 men walked in. They were dressed well, not event well, but the kind of well that belonged nowhere near a civilian engagement party. The suits were dark, the fit precise, and the way they moved through the white tablecloths and champagne flutes was the way water moves through a crack in concrete, inevitable and very, very cold. The man at the front was the one who stopped the room. He was not the tallest. He was not the loudest. He simply moved in a way that made space for itself, his hands clasped at his sides, his eyes scanning the crowd with a patience that had nothing relaxed about it. He was somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since become something more useful than handsome. All hard planes, a jaw that had taken a hit or two and kept its structure, and eyes the particular flat grey of Lake Michigan in November. There was a scar at the left edge of that jaw, thin and old, the kind a man stops noticing long before anyone else does. Dessa had never seen him before. Noel had. She knew this because Noel's hand, which had been resting on the back of her chair, went completely rigid. The blood drained from his fingers. She could see it happen in real time. "Oh God," Noel breathed, very private. "No, not tonight." The man reached the edge of their table and stopped. He looked at Noel the way a person looks at a receipt they've already decided to dispute. "Carver," he said. His voice was low and even, the kind that had never needed to be raised to be heard. There was an accent at the edges of it, Slavic, faint, the consonants precise in the way of someone who had learned English at great expense. "You've been difficult to reach." "Mr. Volkov." Noel pushed back from his chair and stood, which was the wrong instinct. "I can explain. The account, the transfer, everything. I was going to call you Monday. I have the figures ready. You transferred $4.2 million from a holding account registered to Meridian Freight Solutions." Volkov said it the way an accountant reads an invoice line, which is owned by a shell company, which, if you follow the chain far enough, belongs to me. He paused. "You did this on a Tuesday in August. You then used a portion of those funds to rent this room." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. 200 people had stopped breathing. Bree was still standing at the microphone. Dessa looked at Noel. She saw it on his face. Not guilt, not remorse, not the particular expression of a man who has been caught doing something terrible. She saw calculation. She saw him looking from Volkov to the room to the exits, mapping his options, running the same analysis he always ran, the one she had mistaken for confidence for 6 years. He was not a man who loved her. He had never been a man who loved her. He was a man who had looked at her bookkeeping skills and her small savings account and her utter incapacity to believe that anyone she trusted would hurt her and seen a useful piece of furniture. Dessa pushed back her own chair and stood up. "He also borrowed $40,000 from my personal account last spring," she said. Her voice was clear and steady and filled the room in a way she had not planned for. "He told me it was for a medical bill. His mother's, specifically." She looked at Noel's mother, who had lowered her champagne flute. "I'm guessing her health is fine." The woman opened her mouth, closed it. "He has been sleeping with my best friend." Dessa turned to where Bree still stood at the microphone. "I heard them in room 28C an hour ago, so at minimum since this evening. I'm guessing longer, based on the fact that she stopped looking me in the eye around February." Bree sat down. Noel's hand closed around Dessa's wrist, hard. The kind of grip that meant, "Stop, you are embarrassing me." "Let go of my arm," Dessa said very quietly. He didn't. Let go of her arm. That was Volkov. He had not raised his voice. He had not moved, but the two words hit the room like a change in air pressure, and Noel's hand dropped as though it had been burned. Dessa became aware of Volkov looking at her for the first time. Not at the scene she'd caused. At her specifically. Those flat grey eyes moved from the line of her jaw to the set of her shoulders to the way she was still standing, even though her knees had been threatening to buckle for the past 45 seconds. He did not look impressed. He did not look sorry for her. He looked like someone reading a column of numbers and finding that they added up correctly. "You did his bookkeeping," Volkov said. "It wasn't a question." "My own, and the household accounts." She paused. He wasn't particularly careful about what he left on the shared laptop. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth, something colder and more precise than warmth. "Come with me," he said. "I don't know you." "I'm aware." He glanced at Noel, who had begun to visibly sweat through his collar. "You have two choices. You can stay in this room with the people who spent this drinking champagne on money that belongs to me, some of which also belongs to you. Or you can come with me, and I'll explain what happens next to both of us." He picked up her discarded champagne flute from the table, studied it briefly, and set it down. "I have a car." Dessa looked at the 200 faces staring at her. She looked at Bree's ice blue dress. She looked at Noel, who was already avoiding her eyes, his jaw working, composing the version of this story where he was the victim. She picked up her coat from the back of her chair. "Lead the way," she said. The car was a black Escalade with tinted glass and a leather interior that smelled of cedar and something metallic she couldn't name. One of his men held the door. She got in without being offered a hand. Volkov slid in on the opposite side. The door shut with the specific, heavy click of something very well made. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. 4.2 million, Dessa said. And 40,000 that belong to you separately. Volkov was looking at his phone, profile lit by the screen. Carver's debt to me and his debt to you are not the same obligation. What happens to him? He looked up. The screen went dark. "That depends," he said, "on a conversation I'd like to have with you." He told her about his grandfather. 91 years old, 2 months left at the outside, holding the documentation for Upper Eastern port contracts across 3 states, and not releasing a single page of it until a Volkov was married and had been for no fewer than 12 consecutive months. A man who believed that someone who couldn't sustain a household had no business sustaining a supply chain. It was said without irony, the way Volkov seemed to say everything, as data, stripped of editorializing. "You need a wife," Dessa said. "I need one who exists in the next 48 hours and is convincing enough to satisfy a man who has spent 60 years detecting liars." He produced a folded document from his jacket. "You catch discrepancies for a living. You just stood up in a room of 200 people and told the truth on a live microphone. You are not afraid of being wrong. You are afraid of being made a fool of. These are 2 very different qualities." She looked at her hands. The engagement ring, a stone Noel had picked out and she had never loved, caught the passing streetlights. "What do I get?" she asked. He told her the 40,000 cleared from Noel's accounts by morning, a trust in her name funded at 500,000 on execution of a valid marriage certificate, monthly expenses, her own wing of his property 12 months, no proximity clause. He held the document out. She didn't take it immediately. "I keep my job," she said. "My clients know me as Dessa Morse. Legally you can have Volkov. Professionally I keep my name." He studied her, thorough, impersonal, the way a forensic accountant studies a spreadsheet. "Agreed," he said. She took the document, folded it small, pressed it into her coat pocket, which felt like the only intelligent thing she had done since 9 o'clock. "One question," she said. "Go ahead." "Why me specifically? You could have found someone easier." Volkov looked out the window. The skyline was thinning as the car moved north. In the glass she could see his reflection, the flat set of his mouth, the old scar at his jaw, the particular quality of exhaustion he carried the way other men carry authority, So long he'd stopped noticing its weight. "Someone who doesn't ask questions," he said at last, "doesn't notice when things go wrong. I need someone competent." "You noticed $40,000 moving through a shared laptop." He paused. "Most people don't notice $40,000 leaving their own accounts." "I'm an auditor." "Yes," he said, "you are." His property was 40 minutes north of the city. Dark glass and poured concrete set into a hill behind a stone gate, lit with the kind of precise, practical lighting that eliminated shadows without creating warmth. Dessa counted 7 cameras on the driveway approach. That number told her something useful about the baseline threat level of his daily existence. A woman named Agnes met them in the entrance hall. 60s, ramrod posture, eyes that moved from Dessa's evening gown to her outdoor coat with complete neutrality. "East guest suite," Volkov said, removing his jacket. "Have something comfortable sent up." She didn't bring anything. "I have an apartment," Dessa said. "Carver's name is on the lease," which was true and infuriating. "My people will collect your things in the morning." He walked away down the hall without a closing statement. Agnes brought water, folded clothes, and a cup of tea Dessa hadn't asked for. She set everything down, told Dessa breakfast was at 7:30, and left. The guest suite was large and entirely impersonal, which made it easier. There were no other people's things to contend with. It was simply a room, and she had the option to be simply a person inside it. She reached for the zipper. She couldn't reach it, or rather, her hands were shaking too badly to find the pull, and when she did find it, the hook at the top was stuck fast. She sat with both arms bent behind her back in a position that would have looked, to an observer, like a very put-together woman attempting to flag down a passing aircraft. Then she started crying. It wasn't theatrical. It was the specific, private kind of crying that comes after a very long time of not crying. Ugly and physical and entirely beyond managing. She cried for the 6 years. She cried for the $40,000 and the lo mein and the 3 draft speeches texted to her over the past month. She cried for the version of herself that had spent 3 weekends choosing centerpieces for an event that turned out to be a very expensive, very public demonstration of her own blind spots. She cried until her ribs ached and her throat was raw, and there was nothing left in her chest but a dry, scraped-out quiet. She took one slow breath. Then she tried the zipper again. A knock came at the door. 4 seconds, maybe 5, before it opened and Volkov stood in the frame, taking in the situation, the red-edged eyes, the arms twisted behind her back, the visible effort of a woman who had decided to be done with falling apart, without commenting on any of it. "The hook," he said. "It's stuck." He walked over. She turned. His hands were efficient and entirely impersonal, engaged with the task rather than with her. He found the hook, freed it, drew the zipper down in one steady pull. The dress released. She exhaled in a long, involuntary rush. "Thank you," she said. He had already stepped back. Aspirin in the bathroom cabinet. Breakfast at 7:30. He moved toward the door. "Volkov." He stopped. She looked at him over her shoulder. In the low light of the room, jacket gone, sleeves pushed to the elbows, he looked like what he probably was underneath everything else, a man who had been very tired for a very long time. "What do you actually get out of this?" she asked. "The ports, fine, but you could have arranged something simpler." A pause. "My grandfather wants to see me settled before he dies," he said. "He is the only person in my world who has ever wanted something for me rather than from me." He looked at the wall above her head for a moment, as if doing a calculation. "I am not going to find a woman in the next 48 hours who won't embarrass him. You embarrassed no one tonight, but the people who deserved it." He moved through the door. "That's a rare quality." The door closed, quietly with the same contained authority as everything else in his house. Dessa stood alone in the dark room and understood that she had not traded down. She had traded laterally, from a small, invisible danger into a much larger and visible one. The difference was that she could map this one. She could read its numbers. She could work with visible. The documents were tabbed and flagged and organized in a way that told her Agnes had been up since 5 a.m. Dessa read every page at the kitchen island the next morning, while Volkov worked at the other end of the counter, his coffee going cold at his elbow. Neither of them spoke for 40 minutes. "Page 12, she said. "The indemnity clause. The language is ambiguous. If something happens to you in month 7, I want it clear the trust transfers completely regardless of the marriage's legal standing at that point." He looked up from his screen. Something shifted. Not surprise, but a slight recalibration, the way a calculation adjusts when you add a variable it wasn't expecting. "I'll have my attorney revise it this afternoon," he said. "I also want to know the actual threat level, not generalities. If someone is specifically planning something, I want to know. I cannot read a situation accurately if I'm operating on incomplete information." She set the document down. "I am very good at keeping information I'm given." He studied her for a long moment. "There is a man named Breslow," he said, "my late wife's brother. He has contested my position in the organization since her death, on the grounds that a widower without family is a temporary arrangement. If he becomes convinced I am genuinely settled, he will find a different angle." Volkov took a sip of cold coffee. "He will be at a gathering at my associate's house this weekend. That will be your first official appearance." "What's our story?" "We met in October. You were auditing a hospitality group I have partial interest in. I found you difficult." He said this with no particular inflection. "I kept finding reasons to extend the engagement period." She felt the almost law rise in her chest and tamp it back down. "I found you borderline unprofessional," she said. "That works," he said. Breslow was built like a question that didn't want to be answered. Wide in the shoulders, narrow in the eyes, with the particular social confidence of someone who had never once been told no, and had spent decades mistaking this for personal magnetism. He shook Dessa's hand at the door of Victor Lenz's townhouse and held it half a second too long. "Volkov finally found someone willing," he said, showing all his teeth. "We'd begun to wonder." Dessa smiled back with her face and absolutely nothing else. "He didn't find me," she said pleasantly. "I was where I always was. He just finally asked the right questions." Something crossed Breslow's face. Reassessment, recalibration. And then he laughed, because that was the correct social response, and moved on. She felt Volkov's hand settle briefly at the small of her back, not possessive, not warm, simply a point of contact that communicated, noted. She got through dinner. She answered questions about her work with the quiet confidence of someone who was genuinely good at it, which she was, and which couldn't be faked over 60 minutes by anyone paying close attention. She watched Breslow's posture shift over the course of the evening, the loosening of his shoulders, the way his assessments of Volkov moved from probing to something more uncertain. She understood ledgers. She understood when a column stopped balancing. She had tipped Breslow's column before the dessert course. On the drive back, the city lights smeared against the wet glass. Dessa had her shoes off before the door closed, one elbow braced on the armrest, head tipped back against the seat. "Breslow will pull back," Volkov said. "For now." She stared at the roof of the car. "He'll look for something else. Men like that always do. They don't stop, they redirect." "I know. A pause, that's why I want someone who reads patterns." She turned her head. In the dark of the car, his jacket folded on the seat between them. He looked like someone she might have met at a work function under different circumstances. Exhausted. Competent. Someone who had been performing his entire life and was very, very tired of the staging. "What happened to Noel?" she said. He reached into the jacket, pulled out his phone, and turned the screen toward her. The spreadsheet was detailed. Meticulous, actually. She could appreciate the formatting. Noel's brokerage license had been flagged to the regulatory board as of that morning, under 3 separate irregularity codes she recognized as correct, because she had seen the same irregularities herself. The investment firm he worked for had received a letter from one of its largest silent partners, requesting an urgent internal review. The apartment, Noel's name alone on the lease, had received a notice from the management company regarding a violation dated 2 days prior. His accounts, all of them, including the one he'd been using to run the embezzlement, were flagged and frozen. The sports car he'd bought 6 months ago, which she now understood had been purchased with Volkov's money, appeared in a separate line item. Repossessed, current location a salvage facility in Cicero. By Monday, according to the final column, his credit profile would be what the spreadsheet coldly described as non-recoverable. She handed the phone back. She looked at the lake, which was black and enormous and very present in the way Chicago's lake always was in November, like a reminder that the city had been built at the edge of something that did not require its permission. She had wanted Noel destroyed. She had known this since the moment she stood in the hallway at the Ashmore and counted 11 seconds. She had wanted it with the specific, cold clarity she brought to her best work. Not emotional, not theatrical. A clean audit. Every error found, categorized, corrected. She had thought wanting it would feel like something. It felt like a ledger closing. The column summed, the account settled. She became aware that Volkov had not looked away from her. "Do you regret it?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, which she considered a professional obligation. "No," she said. The truth of it was solid and a little surprising. The way a correct answer sometimes is when you've been bracing for a different one. "I don't." He nodded once, as though she had confirmed a figure he'd been carrying. Then he reached across the console and set his hand over hers. Not a gesture, not a statement, just a hand, warm and heavy, and with the quiet weight of someone who was very seldom in the position of offering something without expecting the calculation to run in his direction. She did not move her hand away. Outside, Chicago passed in long, bright streaks of headlights and wet asphalt, and somewhere in the dark between the street lamps, there was a woman who had walked into an engagement party with $60 shoes and 6 years of misplaced loyalty, and walked back out into something she didn't have a name for yet. She was good with numbers. She was good with patterns. She was very good at reading a situation for what it actually was, rather than what she'd hoped it might be. She did not know yet what this particular situation was, but she was beginning to understand that the part that frightened her was not Volkov, not his world, not the Breslows circling its edges, not the 12 months of a contract she was still finishing reading in her head. The part that frightened her was how steady her hands had become.